Okay, well, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cherise Berta, Executive Director of City Building TMU, where we showcase the latest city building and urban innovation happening across campus and bridge sectors to bring TMU expertise to city builders everywhere. I hope you've been enjoying our latest webinar series, and I'm pleased to introduce this session today, which is the last in our series, looking at initiatives of TMU's Ecological Design Lab focused on advancing policy and bylaws to protect biodiversity in the urban setting. Led by Dr. Nina Marie Lister, the lab has been instrumental in pushing to have specific outdated policies and bylaws changed to reflect our new imperative to create climate positive and resilient cities, which you'll hear more about in a few minutes. To begin, I want to provide an acknowledgement that we are in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share a territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So first, a few housekeeping notes. Today's presentation will consist of about 30 minutes of presentation, followed by about 15 minutes to answer selected questions from the audience, and we will wrap up by 11:45. So to submit a question, please enter it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and if you see someone has asked a great question, you can upvote it. And finally, the session is being recorded. You'll be able to find the recording on the City Building TMU website in the coming days, so make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter for all the latest information. And now I'd like to introduce and welcome our speakers. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Nina Marie Lister, professor in our School of Urban and Regional Planning and visiting professor of landscape architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. As a registered professional planner trained in systems ecology, environmental science, and landscape planning, her research, teaching, and practice center on the relationship between landscape infrastructure, biodiversity, and ecological processes, specifically in the context of ecological design for resilience, health, and well-being. At TMU, she founded and directs the Ecological Design Lab, which is a collaborative incubator for research and practice. Among her honors, she holds the Margulies National Design for Living Prize, a membership in the American Society of Landscape Architects, and a senior fellowship at Massey College. Welcome, Nina Marie.
Thanks, Cherise, for a lovely introduction, and what a pleasure to be here to celebrate city building through the Institute and through TMU. In your brief introduction, you've touched on the Ecological Design Lab, and that is a great pleasure to be here today again to celebrate one of our students and my research assistant's work, Elise Cook, who's going to share with us the work that she's been doing through the lab. The most interesting thing for me about these webinars is that we get to share work that's on the ground, happening to advance, connecting people to nature in our cities, which broadly is the mandate of the lab. Elise's work builds on a number of other graduate students and research assistants who've been working in the area of advancing policies and bylaws for biodiversity, and she's going to tell you more about that. I'll just say briefly that the lab has 3 different streams of working towards climate positive and resilient work to support biodiversity generally. And the reason for that is that the United Nations recently recognized that one of the greatest and single greatest thing we can do for climate positive resilience is to protect Earth's biodiversity. And we can start right here at home in our cities. Lise, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I know you're going to share some really interesting and exciting work that you've been doing for your MRP.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nina Marie and Cherise. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, wonderful. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to learn a little bit more about policy, biodiversity, and the city. Apologies. So today's webinar, after the mandated slight tech hiccup, will begin with an introduction to the Ecological Design Lab, biodiversity, its relevancy and relationship to urban planning, and then a discussion of the bylaws for biodiversity project that is currently very exciting on the ground work being taken on by the Ecological Design Lab, before leading to my master's research project on liminal ecologies in the city of Toronto. So to start, I wanted to recognize Nina Marie Lister and the Ecological Design Lab team, past and present, who have made this presentation possible. So led by Nina Marie through TMU's School of Urban and Regional Planning, our lab is an interdisciplinary team of individuals who are committed to investigating and sharing evidence-based solutions to co-creating resilience in the urban setting. So we are passionate about rethinking our collective relationship to nature in the city as a means of addressing complex socio-ecological problems like global climate change, habitat fragmentation, and biodiversity loss. Our model is designed to stimulate collaboration and to narrow the gap between research, practice, and municipal decision-making through the co-creation of knowledge and its transfer between researchers, students, design professionals, citizens, as well as municipal decision-makers. So to begin our discussion of biodiversity in the urban form, it's really important to ground what biodiversity is. So biodiversity can be understood as the genetic diversity within a species, the diversity among species, and the diversity within an ecosystem. Biodiversity provides various indices that can essentially measure ecosystem health. However, aside from these technical definitions and applications, biodiversity is a multidimensional framework in its representation of a range of relationships between and within ecosystems. Research has shown that biodiversity influences things that we maybe wouldn't necessarily expect, like disease resistance and food security, public health, spiritual well-being, in addition to having intrinsic value. Just to note, from this point forward, I will be using the words biodiversity and nature interchangeably to frame this discussion. So as Nina Marie mentioned, in 2019, the Global Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services released a report naming that global biodiversity, the global biodiversity crisis, and warning of a catastrophic loss of species that was in progress. The scientific community as a whole generally recognizes that biodiversity is our strongest natural defense against climate change. And this diagram is adapted from the research of Not et al. In 2019 to elaborate on the relationships between biodiversity, public health, and climate change. So the dark arrows represent climate change as a threat to both biodiversity and public health, while the blue arrows symbolize biodiversity as a benefit to public health, as well as a mitigation strategy for climate change. These dynamics are what brings biodiversity to the forefront of urban planning and policy in order to co-create resilient and cities that are resilient and support public health. Biodiversity is required to be recognized as well as prioritized in policy. So acknowledgement of the climate crisis, as well as the mitigative role of biodiversity, are themes that have come to be represented in Canadian policy. But what is this policy ultimately, and how is it enforced? So commitments to a more sustainable future exist on international, federal, provincial, as well as municipal levels of government. Today, we'll be really honing in on municipal governments, as that is sort of the scope of planning. So in Ontario, municipal governments are responsible for developing an official plan in collaboration with residents to determine the objectives of the municipality and their goals to meet the needs of future communities. So policies and official plans outline permitted uses and requirements for successful applications of land designations. Zoning bylaws are legally enforceable regulations based on the objectives set forth in an official plan. So as you can see, the isolation of these two forms of policy on the slide identify that urban planners and municipal decision makers must consider official plans and zoning bylaw legislation when making decisions to ensure that these decisions are in alignment with the vision set out in these documents. Municipalities and through them, the tools of the official plan and zoning bylaws therefore have significant influence over the cities around us. Other types of policy do not hold the same weight in regards to municipal decision-making. So these are secondary forms of policy that can be utilized and very helpful in reporting on findings and maybe recommending action, but they're not legally binding in the same way. This distinction is important because knowing that not all policy is enforced equally is necessary to understand the legislative commitments that municipal governments have made in the name of biodiversity. So the map on this slide depicts the activation of official plan and zoning bylaws to delineate green spaces such as environmentally significant areas, natural heritage, and city parks within the City of Toronto. And we know that resilience requires the promotion of robust biodiverse habitats. And while public spaces such as parks and protected areas are important, most of the lands in Southern Ontario are actually privately owned. So looking at this map, private property offers significant potential to support biodiversity within the gray areas that you can see here on the City of Toronto. So the potential for private property is critical, and we can, with good policies and supportive bylaws, cultivate biodiversity on and across private land within our communities. And that's just what Beth and Craig Sinclair did in the town of Smith Falls. They chose to cultivate a naturalized garden on their private property, and that was a right protected under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to express environmental ethics. Complaints from neighbors had their lawns subject to municipal scrutiny, and they were facing fines as well as mow orders for their biodiverse garden, in particular, the presence of habitat logs, which you can see on the above photo. The Smith Falls Council deemed that their lawn was not in alignment with the town's property standards bylaw. With the help of environmental lawyer David Donnelly, the support of Nina Marie Lister, the Ecological Design Lab, as well as other invested environmentalists like Lorraine Johnson and Joyce Hostin, the Sinclairs resisted this order from the city. They appealed to the Ontario Superior Court and were supported in their right to cultivate a natural garden. The town of Smith Falls has rescinded the original order and committed to reviewing their property standards bylaw to recognize natural yards. Regardless of the case precedents that are supported by the charter, there are many municipalities in Ontario that continue to have vaguely worded or arbitrarily enforced municipal standards and grass and weeds bylaws that inhibit the cultivation of natural gardens. Reflecting on the experience, the Sinclairs are quoted as saying, "Until the bylaw changes in all 400 municipalities in Ontario, I don't feel very satisfied. We can restore so much nature in our lawns." So they really view this as a partial victory in their capacity to be able to keep their naturalized garden. So bridging the policy divide to promote biodiversity, not just on public, but also private spaces in the city, is the foundation of the Bylaws for Biodiversity project. In the past 3 years, the Ecological Design Lab has been regularly asked to provide advice and support for municipalities across Ontario which are updating their bylaws to support biodiversity and climate resilience. We have collaborated to challenge outdated property standards and grass and weeds bylaws of 14 municipalities across Canada, and more to come. So residents across Canada have reached out to our lab seeking advice due to this case precedent. So their questions often range from how to start a naturalized garden to best practices when resisting mow ordinances or notices of violation that are brought forth by their municipalities. So to address this need from the community, we prepared free public-facing resources that are freely available on the Ecological Design Lab website in order to help individuals navigate these concerns. So these resources include a model grass and weeds bylaw, a frequently asked questions document when naturalizing your lawn, as well as a how to naturalize resource. This accessible research offers a foundation for individuals who are interested in supporting biodiversity in their communities and growing a more resilient future. So far in this talk, I've discussed the power of policy in dictating change in cities and how this policy can be observed in public space through the designation of natural heritage, as well as on private land through the reform of property standards to support biodiversity. So policies that support biodiversity in public and private spaces are adapting in order to meet the needs of promoting biodiversity across Ontario. But what's missing from this picture? What else makes up urban geographies and can support biological thriving in the city? And through my master's research, I felt that this missing piece was liminal space. So the in-between spaces of the city that offer the potential to further support biodiversity. So what is liminal space really? Liminal space can be understood as the leftover or unplanned places in the urban fabric. The concept of liminal space is used to conceptualize change in occupation of the city. So derived from the Latin limen, which means threshold, liminal is defined as between or belonging to two different states or places. Liminal space may be reclaimed without maintenance practices that are often performed to manicure nature in other parts of the city. So as sites in transition between past and future uses, liminal landscapes offer the potential for nuance and reclamation. This reclamation of liminal space can be performed by individuals, by communities, or just by nature. These landscapes are often spaces of resistance, gathering, or shelter for marginalized communities, and engaging with the design or the change of liminal space requires recognition that these in-between spaces may already be important community infrastructure for equity-seeking groups, and their managing them could serve to further marginalize communities. Liminal ecologies may independently seem insignificant. However, collectively, they are mighty. So research, for example, established that 9.5% of the surface area of Somerville, Massachusetts, accounted for spontaneous unmanicured vegetation. And this area alone exceeded the city's parkland. So the process of wilding within urban landscapes speaks to the inherent resiliency of ecosystems. Data on the coverage of liminal ecologies in the city of Toronto or other Ontario cities is not currently available. However, we know that these spaces do exist. As part of my Master's of Planning research, I chose to further engage with the existence and the potential of liminal ecologies in Toronto. So this led to the generation of a lexicon as well as a preliminary inventory of liminal ecologies in Toronto. This work was supervised by Nina Marie Lister and supported by Lorraine Johnson as second reader. The Toronto context meant that review of Toronto policy was a large aspect of the beginning part of my project. And in this review, I found that Western ideological understandings of nature have informed conservation practices as well as natural heritage planning in Ontario. The tendency to separate nature from the city was enforced through legislation to distance what we considered nature from what we considered urban space. Analysis of existing policy in the City of Toronto, as well as secondary policy like the pollinator strategy and the biodiversity strategy, grounded 3 recommendations for how legislation could further support biodiversity and bridge the urban nature divide within the city. These recommendations included, firstly, increasing the legislative power of biodiversity policies. As discussed prior, not all policies hold the same authority over municipal decision-making. So therefore, increasing the capacity for the objectives of secondary policies like the pollinator strategy and the biodiversity strategy to be represented in legislation and inform municipal decision-making is necessary in order to see these outcomes realized. Secondly, I recommend that expanding systems of valuing biodiversity in policy was a means of potentially bridging the culture and nature divide in urban design. So recognition for the public health and the mental health, spiritual, environmental, and intrinsic value of biodiversity in legislation could help encourage urban planning to further support biodiversity as integrated in the city. Thirdly, expanding the definitions of nature that we protect and recognize in the city to consider liminal ecologies and support their thriving was my final recommendation, which led to the compilation of a lexicon. So activating liminal ecologies requires legibility, and that's the ability to name, recognize, and develop a common understanding and shared value for these spaces. In her development of the Bay Lexicon, Jane Wolfe speaks to the importance of standardizing accessible language to further public discussions. And this work is necessary to reduce the silos between experts, policymakers, and everyday people to engage in conversations about nature and the city. So this lexicon frames understanding of the nuances of liminal ecologies and makes the argument for advocating for them and change in the city accessible. In this work, I established a lexicon supported by literature and the unique geography of Toronto. The intent of this work is to provide language that can be used to further understand these spaces and their potential in the city. An accompanying preliminary inventory gathered from Google Earth provides examples of the existence of these ecologies in the City of Toronto. So this slide identifies 3 of the terms that are raised in the lexicon, the first being a microsite, which is pavement flora or a growth through the cracks of construction. Next, a gap, which is the physical space between buildings, fences, and alleyways and laneways in Toronto are common examples of gap ecology. Thirdly, structural, which is a word that can be used to describe the integration of habitat into infrastructure. So habitat that utilizes infrastructure as a foundation to grow, crawl, or propagate. This lexicon goes on to continue exploring other characteristics and geographies of liminal ecologies on vacant lots, street verges, and rail corridors, supported by literature with examples from the City of Toronto. So I just wanted to give you a little taste and not sort of overwhelm you with lots of new language. So moving into what activating liminal ecologies could look like. Temporary use is a powerful mechanism for transforming the city. When provided new opportunities to engage with the city, residents have the opportunity to critique the status quo and push the boundaries of the accepted narratives about the city forward. Temporary uses of spaces are mechanisms of empowerment for communities to participate in design. The support of liminal ecologies in the short term does not necessarily have the same conservation ethic as that we often see in natural heritage planning. However, temporary liminal ecologies have the potential to address the unmet needs of communities by traditional planning techniques. So the Bowery project in Toronto, seen in the top photo, is an example of community-led activation of vacant lots to meet the needs of the local community. The Bowery project uses liminal space in the city, so lots in various stages of development to ground temporary urban agriculture infrastructure. So this community organization is responsible for responding to systemically unmet needs of the community. Evident through this project, liminal ecologies therefore have the potential to shift the social and cultural understanding of nature in the city. And with these shifts, the valuation of nature can transform temporary to more permanent solutions possible through the reimagination of urban space. So what comes next? Returning to the map of biodiversity protected in the city on public lands, we can sort of compile different aspects of this talk to recognize that supporting more comprehensive and connected ecological thriving requires policy reform that promotes biodiversity on private as well as public spaces in the city. Recognizing that community-empowered temporary activation of liminal ecologies are instrumental in working alongside institutional movements for biodiversity is also necessary. So the power of the temporary can continue to push forward the opportunity for policy change and the planning of cities that reflect community values, as seen in the Bowery project. People shape the city, but policy facilitates the barriers as well as the opportunities of this collective growth. So reducing the policy barriers to urban biodiversity is required to mitigate the harms of global climate change and co-create resilient and healthy cities. Legislation that enables ecological thriving in private space as well as public space and liminal space is necessary. Only through the activation of the potentialities of biodiversity in the city can we facilitate the collective reimagining of a more climate resilient Toronto, as well as more climate resilient cities all over the world. So I just wanted to extend my gratitude for your time today. Nina Marie and I will now be taking any questions that you may have regarding today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was just so fascinating. I have so many questions, which will go beyond the length of this webinar, including how do we get out there and do this radical gardening in those liminal spaces I now have a name for. I want to encourage the audience or participants to ask some questions in the Q&A. I also have some moderated questions for both of you, but before that, I'm just going to turn it over to Nina Marie to see if she has anything to add to the great information that you've provided.
Well, the first thing, thank you, Cherise, to say is thank you, Elise. What a pleasure it has been to work with you over the last several years, actually, as you came into this master's research project. Each of the students that joins the lab often joins first as a research assistant and then finds a project in one of the 3 streams of work that we do. And Elise, right from the beginning, you were always really interested in the connection to urban nature and ways to take a science background, a rich background that you had in living systems and ecosystem sciences, to bring that into urban planning in a way that's tangible and also has, I think, the important component of design activism, of the planner as advocate for something that is desperately needed right now. And I really appreciate that this master's research project in particular, while yes, technical to a certain extent in terms of the science that supports it, in terms of the policy around which it's framed, is also about agency, about empowerment and connection, particularly in communities that have typically been overstepped. We know that we're hearing a lot right now about the gentrification of parks, that when parks that have a lot of capital investment go into neighborhoods, the tax values go up, the property values go up. We're in a housing affordability crisis, and it's really easy to see very clearly that there is, in many respects, a kind of unfortunate alignment between the wealth of housing and privilege with green space, shading and cooling benefits that even go along with the privilege of living next to a beautiful manicured park, or even a park that's partially wild. This is about the in-between. This is about bridging the gap between private and public. And most importantly, this work offers us a way literally to connect. Most of the work that we do in the lab is about connectivity. It's about the freedom to roam, the recognition that we all need to move. And never was that more clear than during COVID. So Elise, your work has come at a time when we've really recognized collectively the importance of reconnecting to nature for physical and mental health benefits, as well as all the other ecosystem benefits you mentioned. So my comments are really about the importance of this work, and my hope that we can dive into some of this in the questions about how we make this happen, and about the importance of this work in showing and recognizing how transitional connected spaces really provide an opportunity to get out there and enjoy nature.
Thanks, Nina Marie. Elise, just one question for you, and then it looks like a lot of questions are popping up from our audience. It really feels like you're on the cutting edge of something new. And I'm curious if you've taken inspiration from other cities that have successfully managed to, because it sounds like in a lot of those liminal spaces, it's kind of like this gray area of, is it private, is it public? How do you navigate that? And this might be a question for you as well, Nina Marie. How do you navigate that? And are you finding that some municipalities are actually being proactive and trying to solve this with their leadership, or is this coming mostly from private citizens?
Let's start with Elise, and then we'll see.
Yeah, thank you, Charisse. That's a very interesting question. I think that when it comes to larger scale liminal ecologies, some of which I did discuss in my project, there is support from the city because they're larger properties or larger swaths of land, so they don't necessarily fly under the radar in the same regard. So I specifically discussed Nature Park, which is a example of an abandoned rail yard that was reclaimed and then is available as a recreational public park, but also sort of a conservation wild area within the heart of a city in Germany. So I think that there are really great examples of how sort of more informal ecologies can be supported and fostered on a citywide level, but there are also really interesting examples of how sort of independent residents, whether they're guerrilla gardeners or community organizations, are sort of not necessarily asking for permission in engaging with nature in these in-between spaces that, as you mentioned, have sort of a uncontested ownership or management model.
Yeah, and I would add to that a little bit, Elise, that, you know, there are examples here in Toronto that are really picking up that same cue, where people aren't waiting for the city or capital investor to come in and make a new private park, or the city to, you know, really in a place where land is reached, you know, and its apogee in value, to create a park. So what can we do? Well, we're taking over the edges, the verges, oftentimes the right of way in between a person's, where you have a split sidewalk from the yard. That's it, that little strip of land between the sidewalk and the road is owned by the city, but often managed by homeowners or even residents groups. Sometimes a group of people informally in the neighborhood will do that. And we've definitely seen court precedent where those verges, if you will, have been used for edible vegetables, and the city has decided not to do anything. Almost, I think you mentioned this in your talk, or you alluded to it at least, the don't ask, don't tell. They're not asking for permission. They're just going ahead and doing something. Now, sometimes that doesn't work well when the vegetation perhaps impedes traffic visibility or creates an unsafe condition. But that is oftentimes to be determined by the community in consultation with the city. So these are actions that are already happening. Even, for example, the West Toronto Rail Path or the so-called Green Line along the rail line. These are not safe places for children to run and play on the rail line, but adjacent to it, where it creeps out of the fence and before you get to the road, sometimes neighborhoods take those over. They put in a perennial garden or a pollinator pathway, allowing native vegetation to create a flowering condition that even under drought provides really important nectaring sources for insects that are on my t-shirt, for example, right? That we're creating a service, a benefit, not only for pollinators, but for beautifying a neighborhood. So I think those are really important initiatives that we see in a very small scale, these microsites and gaps that you wrote about, creeping into our consciousness and providing really strong evidence that these areas work. They create a new aesthetic as well for a city, I would say.
Amazing. Sign me up, by the way, if you need some volunteers to get out there and get your hands dirty. Just looking to the Q&A, a question from Kiara. Hi, Kiara, nice to see you. See your question. She's wondering if what your method was, Elise, to evaluate the ecosystem services provided by the liminal ecologies you identified.
For sure. So valuation is an interesting metric, but I honestly looked to existing literature. So even though the words that I chose in this talk were liminal ecologies, there are a lot of writings on informal green spaces, as well as spontaneous or unmanicured urban vegetation. So more extensive long-term study on the ecosystem services of these small spaces do exist. So though investigation is still required, ultimately, when it comes to facets of urban cooling and pollinator habitat and even stormwater management, as mentioned, the sort of collective sum of the small spaces does influence the functioning and the resilience of the city. So in terms of the actual ecosystem services of a microsite, I don't know if I can speak to that, but the collective value that these ecologies can have to the city is evident in secondary literature.
Yeah, I would add just to that too, Elise, it's really important to recognize what is it we're measuring and for whom. A lot of your research focused on value for neighborhoods that often have no connectivity, there's poor connectivity, or that there is an opportunity for transitional or ephemeral landscapes that provide, say, a temporary food garden that's in a lot that's undergoing change, that are container-based, for example. These also provide community engagement activities, oftentimes around schools. So that we do lots of examples for that. If we're talking about the performance, meaning landscape performance, there are definitely plenty of compiled pieces of evidence for sites that we can extend from. The Landscape Architecture Foundation, for example, has a series called the Landscape Performance Series, whereby landscape architects in tandem with urban ecologists have undertaken studies to evaluate, for example, the percentage of green vegetation on a microsite that cumulatively provides stormwater infiltration, how much in terms of cubic meters after a rain event, or for example, the percentage of leaf area measured by remote sensing that provides urban cooling in a particular park area with deciduous canopy cover, for example. So there are absolutely ways to do this, and Elise has referenced a lot of those as secondary literature in her study. So rather than these being about performance-based metrics that were derived from primary research on each site, you really looked at these as a series of indicators across your lexicon through which you built this template. Of course, we'd like to see those translated into primary research studies in existing conditions in Toronto, but now we have a lexicon and now we have a template. So good job, Elise.
Such a great first step to really scale this. So another question is around your research, Elise, wondering if any zoning bylaws or other pieces of legislation you came across that might prevent or facilitate urban biodiversity in the city. This could be in Toronto or beyond, or even in private or public spaces.
For sure. Yeah. So I think that whenever we think about the activation of bylaws in the city, we really just have to think about what we're used to seeing around us. So I think the stereotypical or the predictable traditional aesthetic of nature in cities is it's turf grass, it's mowed, maybe there's like selective flowers, but the real emphasis on a lot of urban nature is that it's clean, or that it's orderly, and it's easily managed. So for the Toronto example specifically, there's no specific bylaw, I believe, about street trees, but I feel like we can engage with the concept of why are all of the street trees on the street the same species? So what leads us to make those planning and design decisions to really streamline orderly nature and manicured nature? So I think that is just my initial thoughts on what bylaws are inhibiting biodiversity. I don't know if Nina Marie has more to say on that.
Oh, at least you know me. I always have more to say about bylaws. We really have I would say a crisis condition where we have 400 municipalities in Ontario, most of which are not in compliance with an Ontario Superior Court decision that clearly says individuals have the right to plant what they wish in their yards, as long as it's not harming anyone or it's not harming ecology or our human safety. So that's a pretty big statement. And yet most municipalities, as Elise has said, are very clearly, even inadvertently, enshrining a kind of colonial aesthetic of a monocultural lawn, which at its very best is a crop that produces no value. It's never allowed to flower. When you don't flower, you don't reproduce, you don't feed. So think about that as the enshrined idea of what nature is in our cities. What liminal spaces can offer is a really powerful illustration of a more, what I would say, fruitful, lush and layered life form that actually gives food, shelter, forage. It can be edible by people, can be edible by pollinators, nectar for insects, nectar for birds, insects for birds, right? That layered, lush landscape is a different aesthetic. And what Elise's work is doing is giving us a tool to show and tell. Show what rewilding looks like in these spaces. And that's the bridge between all of the really good work we do for public policy. I mean, we have a ravine strategy in Ontario, in Toronto. We have a biodiversity strategy in Toronto. So on the one hand, we're doing all of this work that encourages nature in all of its messy, layered, stratified, lush glory. And on the other hand, we're telling individual people in their private property, you can't do that. You have to have a lawn, it has to be clipped and neat. And we have this very outdated idea of order and control and clean. That's not what nature looks like. So liminal spaces are the bridge. They connect from those private places to the public spaces. We're already doing this work. We're letting those public spaces creep out into the public realm and normalize a nature-full city, in the word of Tim Beatley, right? The biophilic cities movement is really lovely for helping identify what a nature-full city looks like. And liminal spaces are part of where this starts. So if we want to rewild the city and we want the city to take a cue, well, they're already doing this in some public places. Let's let that creep into the public realm or the private realm and really offer everyday citizens, whether they have a collective co-op, tenants group, even a series of planters that interconnect in a condo or apartment building, we can start to really encourage that rewilding aesthetic that supports all life forms. So this is a really, really powerful ability to show how that works.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. Many municipalities are in the process of going through an official plan, a municipal comprehensive review. What recommendations or policy suggestions would you have for policy staff to incorporate into the updated OPs to help wilding, greening with these liminal spaces?
Well, I think that is the exact question that really led me to the development of the lexicon. So in order to support biodiversity in these spaces and protect biodiversity in these spaces, we needed sort of an example to look to of what they were and where we could find them. So I think the roadmap of the lexicon could be helpful for policymakers when deciding to institute more integrative urban biodiversity, and the lexicon and the inventory serve as examples of what these spaces could look like. But I really think that it's up to the great planners who are out there in various Ontario municipalities to really prioritize urban biodiversity and say that and recognize that it really can be, as Nina Marie said, bridged on private property as well as liminal spaces to co-create resiliency in cities. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the final thing I'd say, that's really powerful here is that we have a model bylaw on our website designed by one of our other research students who did a webinar with us, Carly Murphy. And that model bylaw is a first step for the private side of things to show municipalities exactly how to include a bylaw that recognizes what we would call healthy yards. Healthy yards are biodiverse. There's no assumption about a turf grass that must be cut or even a lawn size. It simply says that your yard is a place to grow a biodiverse range of plants for lots of species. That's a first step. The liminal spaces, the roadside verges, the microsites, the laneway linkages. This is a next step where we show, even just as we're doing with housing, where we are now normalizing multiplexes and alternative modalities for affordable housing can be the coach house, the laneway, the granny suite, the multi-generational living spaces, which used to be called single-family residential. We can do the same thing for plant life. Stop homogenizing, start diversifying.
Great. You guys are amazing. I love this lab. The work that you've done, Elise, is amazing. And I wish you luck in your next steps after graduating this year. So congrats. And Nina Marie, thank you as always for your incredible work. And no part of the city is left unturned with you and your Ecological Design Lab. I'm so grateful to have you on this webinar, and thanks to you both, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thanks, Cherise and CBI. We're so grateful for the partnership to get this word out there and make our cities more livable.
Okay, bye everyone. Take care.
Thank you.